tonight's speaker for, gosh, at least 25 going on 30 years. And we were talking about this earlier. I first met him formally. He says it was sooner, but I remember meeting him when he was one of the brighter creatives pigeonholed over at the in the back rooms of the Roanoke Times, back when they had a creative department, which is saying something. I won't go any further, but that was there was a time where they actually had a creative department that was award-winning as well. Now, I was a young marketing professional in the nonprofit sector, and as was Todd over at the Roanoke Times, and our paths kept crossing over the years. It's one of those crazy things, mutual friends and similar interests. So I've always known Todd, and I've known him to be a great marketing copywriter, among other things, but there's just so much more about him. He's got that creative spark you need when you're trying to come up with a really good idea. And so from there, he soon left the back rooms of the Roanoke Times and co-founded the area's, I will call it the most prolific, at least in my time, advertising firms called Access. And you all have heard of Access. That was his baby, along with Tony Pierman. And for the next 20 plus years, I don't know how many exactly, he became a highly regarded talent in the regional, state, and even the national level of the advertising world. So I've truly enjoyed watching his success. And now we're getting old, long in the tooth and all that, and our backs are hurting and we're stooping. And but one of his non-professional attributes that I've also got to brag on is his undying love of baseball trading cards. You may recall he had a little shop down in Wasena years ago. I don't know if you knew him back then, but he did. I don't know how it went or for how long, but I remember, yeah. And so that led him to becoming quite an expert, and highly regarded expert in that field for the past several decades. So it's at this intersection of his two loves, creative writing and baseball cards, that brings Todd to us tonight. And it's due to the publication of his latest book, Baseball Cards at the Edge of War. I asked him to provide a formal bio, and I always get a kick out of these because I want to see what people write and what they don't write. And Todd says that he is a Roanoke, Virginia-based marketing consultant and creator. All this is true. He is a recipient of the American Advertising Federation's Silver Medal for lifetime contributions to the advertising industry, and a member of the Marshall University School of Journalism and Mass Communications Hall of Fame. I do not know, I know Marshall fans, and if you all know Marshall fans, they are rabid, right? This guy is one of the most, so I'll leave it at that. But Todd volunteers for many causes, including one that I'm very familiar with called Sleep in Heavenly Peace. They make bunk beds for children who are at risk and in economic hardships, and who basically don't have a bed to sleep on. And he also volunteers at the Bradley Flea Clinic. Yeah. Free Clinic, Project Warm. He's an active member of Oak Grove Church of the Brethren. He enjoys playing guitar and is an avid, as I've said, baseball card collector. But in addition to this book, he also concepted, wrote, and co-produced Shine. What he didn't mention, I'm going to get back to that, he didn't mention that he's also running an advertising agency now called Red Ball Advertising and Public Relations here in Roanoke. So just in case you're needing to, consult with one of those, Red Ball is the name of it. But he didn't put that in here, so that's, I'm sure because he did not come here tonight to sell his advertising firm. But the book, on the other hand, costs $20. And if you want to buy the book, it's right over there. And I've got mine, and I did pay full for it. All right, so he was involved also in creating a full-length documentary called Shine, The Legacy of Roanoke's Advertising Men and Women. And it captured the history of this whole industry throughout Southwest Virginia. He lives with his wife, Rhonda, who's with us tonight, and does most of his writing on his screen porch, he says, with his dog, Gracie, by his side. In his first novel, Way Out Wayne, pays homage to his hometown and weaves in details about the places of his youth. Before we welcome Todd to the podium, I just want to ask, am I correct in looking up Wayne, and it's like about a half-hour south of Huntington?
It is, yeah.
Through the mountains, the roads don't even, it looked like there wasn't even a road on Google Maps. And
you have to zoom in, yeah.
Yeah. It's like you have to airlift to school in the morning, It's great. So this, yeah, so it's, when you say Way Out Wayne, it's way out there in Wayne. but I know that's not what the book's about. I'll let him tell you about that. It's my great pleasure. I'm going to shut up now. Help me welcome Todd Marcum to the stage.
You're all right. Thanks a lot. See, first of all, I really, really want to thank you all for coming, spending a little time with me tonight to listen to me blather on about baseball cards. I hope you're a baseball fan. If you're not, it's only going to be about 45 minutes. And I hope your phone's fully charged so you can play solitaire. But now, this has been just a wonderful adventure for me. A lot of this Stephen covered, but this is my second book, and there were several things that led me to this that I'll talk about later. My first book was a completely fictional book. This is a nonfiction book. And it's just interesting. As a person who spent my whole life writing, I like trying my hand at different things. I like to write the way that I like to read. Most of my books are really quick reads, and they're kind of bathroom reads. You know, you can read a little bit, and that would be, that'll be fine. We are not native Roanokeers, but we've lived here for 40 plus years now. This was one of those things that we moved here, and I thought we would stay 6 months until we moved somewhere bigger. And my wife thought we would live here 6 months until we moved back home. And this is just where God intended us to be. We've been so blessed here. It's just been a wonderful place for us. I've been a baseball fan for just about as long as I could walk. I love the game very much. It didn't particularly love me back. I was not a very good player. But one of the things one of the blessings of being not that talented at baseball is you have to learn how to do things. You don't just have this natural ability to hit the ball, or the natural ability to catch the ball, or the natural ability to run. You have to learn what are the situations that you do that in. That, as a fan, that helped me appreciate good players when I saw good players. But more than that, that allowed me to really gain an appreciation. And no matter what you love, whether it's literature, whether it's baseball, whether it's music, the best thing you can do is pass on that love to another person. And when you've had to work to gain that, you have the ability to explain things. I had the great fortune to coach a bunch of kids, to coach T-ball all the way up to where they start playing high school baseball. And still every now and then one will come up and say, "Hey coach, how you doing?" And oh, that'll light me up for a week. That is so great to hear that. But as I said, the lack of talent was actually a great blessing for me. Along that way, I became a baseball card collector. I started by going to Ben's IGA, and you would pay a nickel, and you'd get your Topps cards, and you'd dutifully sort them through, and you had that little pink slab of bubble gum, which got smaller every year, and it was powdery and crunchy and unlike anything else. Just a wonderful part of youth. I also, when I was a boy, I began writing some of these old players. Many of the players that are featured in the book, I may have written a letter to at some point. And back then it was different. They'd write you back. I had Joe DiMaggio write me back. The idea of being a sports celebrity was a very different thing. But this project started in the weirdest way. Back in 2008, 2009, I had a business, and I don't know if you remember what the economy was like back then, but it wasn't much fun. I had 15 people working with me, and we literally had nothing to do. And there's nothing more soul-sucking than having nothing to do when you come into work. So I was going out, I was hitting all these dry wells, saying, "Look, I'll do work for nothing. I just need something for these people to do to give them hope." But that was so frustrating. I said, I have to do something, so I'm not going to get into this muck and mire that we're going through this economic thing. So I started learning to program websites. There was a guy who worked for AOL, and he would meet me at the library every Tuesday, just like his piano lesson, and he would teach me a little bit about how to do a website. Well, I needed something to fill that up. I was collecting the 1941 double play cards at the time, and I said, "Oh, this is as good as anything." 10 years later, I came across that old website, which is still out there somewhere, and I said, "This isn't bad. This could turn into a book." And lo and behold, it did. This book mainly focuses on 1941, and as a nation, we were waiting for war. We knew war was imminent. It began preparing years before, but we weren't in war yet for most of that year. for the first time, mainly because of war production, the unemployment rate dipped into the single figures, and that was tremendous for people who had struggled through the Depression. It gave us leisure time to do things. Dumbo premiered that year. Wonder Woman and Captain America. CBS and NBC came online that year. The National Gallery of Art work, and the National Gallery of Art opened, and there were movies and life in America, although it had its flaws, especially with race relations, with class relations, with things like that. There were certainly flaws, but it felt more like normal life in 1941 than it had in a decade. Up until the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, life had pretty well gone on, and part of that life was just an amazing, amazing baseball season. I'll try not to get too far into the baseball weeds here, but I may stop and explain a few things. Joe DiMaggio had one of the greatest years of any player, but it didn't really start out that way, because the Yankees really struggled out of the gate. They were used to winning the World Championship. That was the goal. If you were a New York Yankees, you won the World Championship. You were the team that had Lou Gehrig. You were the team that had Babe Ruth. That is what you did. They didn't make the World Series the year before. The Tigers did, and they really struggled coming out at the beginning of the season. And after they'd gotten hammered by the Chicago White Sox on May 15th, they lost 13-1, which is a very lopsided score by baseball standards. Their record was 14-15, so they were under 500. And people were saying, this is a washed-up team. These guys are old. Nothing's going to happen. But one thing happened in that game, and that was that a 26-year-old Joe DiMaggio got a hit. That's not unusual. Joe DiMaggio was a great player. But what was unusual is that single that he did started him on the road to one of the most legendary achievements in baseball, and it rejuvenated the Yankees franchise entirely. He went on to collect hit after hit, game after game, and it's what's called a hitting streak. It means you get a hit every night, every game, So when this hitting streak grew to about 20, the local newspapers started to notice. And then when he broke the Yankees team record at 29, everybody started to notice. It was one of those weird things that baseball isn't like it was then. But for a period of time, the question that you would run in, when you would run into somebody on the street, it would be, how'd Joe do today? Did Joe get a hit today? So it went on and on. He broke the American League record of 41, which was held by George Sisler. And they actually had to go back and research what the all-time record for the most hits in a game was, and they found, I think it was 1896, Willie Keeler had batted in 44, hit in 44 games. Well, he surpassed that, and he just kept hitting until July 17th, when they played the Cleveland Indians, and he had a magnificent game hitting, but for some reason, the Indians just were flawless that day. And on 2 occasions, they threw him out when anybody else, it would have normally been a hit. So his hitting streak ended at 56. An interesting thing, that's why the 56 is there. Interesting thing about his 56-game hitting streak is that Heinz 57 was going to pay him a bonus if he got 57 hits. And he hit in 57 games in a row. So he never got that money. Joe DiMaggio did fine, though. I think one of the most fascinating parts is the next day, after this long 56-game hitting streak, he started another 16-game hitting streak. So he got hits in 72 out of 73 games. A good way to figure out how great an accomplishment is what does the number 2 thing look like? It's common to have a home run record beat by 1 or 2 or whatever. The second longest hitting streak is 44 games by Pete Rose and Willie Keeler. So the 56 is astounding, and the idea that he nearly hit in 72 games in a row is just almost unthinkable. I'm going to read a couple of the profiles. Every player who had a card this year has a profile in my book. So they're appetizers. They're not meant to be a full history of the player. They're meant to tell some interesting things that'll get you interested. And if you want to find out more about the player, whether it's a great player like DiMaggio or a secondary player, then there's different ways to do it. Joe DiMaggio needs no introduction. The three-time MVP is possibly best known for his 56-game hitting streak, but was also the fifth leading home run hitter of all time at the time of his retirement. A 13-time All-Star and 9-time world champion, he was elected to Baseball's Hall of Fame in 1955. His sterling career almost never got started. After starring in the Pacific Coast League in 1933 and 34, he tore the ligaments in his left knee while stepping out of a taxi cab, hurrying to meet his sister for dinner. Although many teams considered him damaged goods, 2 Yankee scouts insisted the club sign him. By 1936, he'd become the cornerstone for the next edition of the Yankees dynasty. Joe transcended baseball. He was, of course, married to Marilyn Monroe. In his retirement, he was a spokesman for Mr. Coffee. Long after his retirement, his name was included in popular songs. Listen to this list of artists. The artists that wrote songs with Joe DiMaggio's name in it included Simon and Garfunkel, Billy Joel, Michael Jackson, Jennifer Lopez, Bill Anderson, John Fogerty, and Nas. So can you imagine a more varied group of musicians? The Yankee Clipper was a superstar who carried himself with such grace and dignity. He was, by general acclamation, considered the greatest living player until his death in 1999. Now, DiMaggio wasn't the only one who had a really legendary year in 1941. For the non-baseball fans, if you hit 300, you're considered a very good baseball player. That means you get 3 hits out of 10 at-bats. It's a minor oversimplification, but for working purposes, it's fine. A lot of players hit 250, and if you're a power hitter, that's fine. But this was a year that Ted Williams assaulted logic as far as his hitting goes. Now, people had hit 400 before, but no one had hit 400 in, I think it was about 15 years before he did it. Ted Williams had an amazing season, never hovering far below the 400 mark. But on the next to last day of the season, playing against Philadelphia A's, he went 1 for 4, and his batting average for the first time since July crept below 400. Technically, it didn't, though. With baseball math, he was at 399.55, which rounds up to 400. And his record books would have reflected that. So his manager came to him the next day and said, "You know, this is a pretty big deal. We have only one day left in the season. We have a doubleheader against Philadelphia. It doesn't make any difference in the standings. Why don't you just take the day off, and that'll be fine. You'll have your 400 record, and that'll be great." Well, Williams was too proud to take that. Now, the other thing is, Williams was 22 at the time. 22. My socks are 22 years old. and so he thought, oh, this is probably something I'm going to do like every season or whatever. So he refused to take the day off. But he quickly killed the suspense on, are you going to bat for 100 or not, by going 4 for 5 in the first game. Then he picked up two more hits in the nightcap to post a 406 average for the season, which is phenomenal. To give you an idea, no one has hit 400 since. All the great hitters, hasn't mattered. Nobody has hit 400 since. So, another thing that I think is kind of interesting footnote is with today's scoring rules, Williams would have hit 411 because he had 6 sacrifice flies, which are no longer counted against your batting average, but were at that time. It was just an astounding year, and he did that with power, and he wasn't a punch and Judy hitter. He was a legitimately great hitter. And this is the Ted Williams entry out of the book. Ted Williams is quite possibly the greatest hitter who ever lived. I recommend Ted Williams, A Biography of an American Hero. It's a book filled with sadness and glory. He was a pilot in World War II. He had just amazing eyesight. His uncanny eyesight allowed him to decide whether he wanted to hit the top part of the ball or the bottom part of the ball, depending on the game situation. He developed concepts on hitting that were decades ahead of his time. The 19-time All-Star had a career batting average of .344, 521 home runs, and an all-time leading on-base percentage of .482, despite missing several prime seasons to World War II and the Korean conflict. One of my favorite stats is that during Joe DiMaggio's legendary hitting streak that we just talked about, the Yankee Clipper hit .408. During the same stretch, Ted Williams hit .412. Williams loved to talk about hitting. He came to a minor league game in Salem, Virginia in 1989. He and Salem manager Rocky Bridges, an 11-year major leaguer himself, spoke at length about the finer points of hitting around the batting cage. Two men, decades removed from their playing days, acting like kids in the schoolyard, swinging ghost bats at imaginary pitches. In addition to being one of the inner circle greats of the Baseball Hall of Fame, Ted Williams is also a member of another Hall of Fame. Can anybody guess which one? The Fishing Hall of Fame. Who watches baseball? Who won the World Series this year? The Dodgers, yep. That's true. Which was actually the same two teams that played in the World Series this year. 1941 was a pivotal year for the Dodgers. People always the Dodgers have been as successful as virtually any franchise since 1940. But prior to that, they were a ragtag, terrible group of players. They consistently finished among the worst in the league. They hadn't been to the World Series in 20 years, and just they were almost embarrassing in their ineptitude. But literally, this was the year that it turned around. It actually started turning around a couple years ago when Larry McPhail came to Brooklyn to be their general manager. He did some things that were really innovative for the time. He put lights in Ebbets Field. He upgraded the fan experience. He started broadcasting the games on radio, which was, they had a gentleman's agreement that they wouldn't, and he said, nah, I'm not the gentleman that made that agreement. One of the things that he did that was the biggest key is he hired Leo DeRocher. If you have hair my color, and most of you do, you may remember Leo DeRocher. He actually became sort of he had really good comedic timing, and he had like guest shots on the Munsters and several shows in the 60s. But he and McPhail hated each other. It said that McPhail fired him 100 times, only to hire him back the following day. But as much as they loathed each other, they were able to get along well enough to really have a good team. And that began the foundation. There were certain pickups, certain players that came that started in 1941 that changed the Dodgers' whole mentality from being a loser to being a successful team. A big part of that was when McPhail was drafted. He had his friend Branch Rickey come and take his place. Branch Rickey was the man who led to integration in the major leagues, and he was the one who brought in Jackie Robinson and a lot of others. So this was a really pivotal year. They didn't have a great World Series, but the team actually generated 1.2 million fans, which was an astounding number and record for Ebbets Field. It's really easy as fans when we think of baseball. Our tendency is to think of big league baseball, of Major League Baseball. But baseball was all around. You know, the Negro Leagues had a great year in '41. You know, I like this quote. There is one thing that distinguishes the Negro National League ball players from their Major League brethren, and that is their wholehearted enthusiasm and their genuine zest. They play baseball with a verve and flair that's lacking in the big leagues. The 41 season, the Negro Leagues were interesting. They had 6 teams in the East and 6 teams in the West, and sometimes they'd play, but it was almost like the rapper wars. The East Coast guys didn't really like the West Coast guys. West Coast guys didn't really like the East Coast guys. The biggest thing that happened in that league that year was Satchel Paige came back. He had a sore arm for about 3 years, and he led the Kansas City Monarchs to their third straight pennant. He was probably the highest paid professional baseball player during his day. He made about $37,000, which prorated is about an $800,000 salary today. You know, there were other great players. Monty Irvin was what led the league in hitting in the East. And Roy Campanella, who would become a Dodgers catcher, was only 20 years old, but had already been a professional player for 4 years at 20 years old. So he started at 16. He was the MVP of the East-West All-Star game. The interesting thing was, it was played at Kaminsky Park, and that drew 50,000 fans, which is an astounding number. People cared about baseball, and people cared about the Negro Leagues at that time. And just really quickly, the one thing that I think is fascinating is that even though we don't think of it as such, baseball was already a global sport in 1941. The Mexican leagues, rich owners, were actually stealing players from the Negro leagues. The reason I didn't mention Josh Gibson, who was a great player, is he went from the Negro leagues to the Mexican leagues because he could make so much more money. In just a couple of years, they started stealing not the top talent, but the secondary talent from the major leagues. And there was a very good caliber of ball being played in Mexico. Japan had been playing baseball for 50 years and had a professional league for probably 20. And while they went in fits and starts during the war, as you might imagine, they were able to continue with a serviceable league for the whole time. There were professional leagues in Puerto Rico, there were professional leagues in Cuba, Venezuela, and even Europe had some semblance of baseball, though it certainly wasn't being played with any regularity at that time. But I do think it's interesting that we think of the Shohei Ohtanis and the new guys globalizing baseball. But baseball's been globalized for a very long time. And if you were a baseball card collector, this was a wonderful year. It was one of the very rare times that three different companies were making baseball cards. So you could go to your corner store and you could get different ones. Baseball cards are a lot like cars. You can recognize them if you know what they look like. There was the Double Play Company, which is the one at the end. They were personified because they had two players on each team, usually teammates, and it was a pretty big set. They had 150 subjects over 75 cards with 110 just individual players that were represented. The Galley cards, which is the black and white card with yellow background, that was they had a their cards were not very good that year, but they're very hard to come by. So that they were often miscut. There were a lot of problems with them. But for all its shortcomings, it's a really difficult set for a collector. And they had mostly journeyman players in it, just some players who weren't even active anymore, players who just were scrubs, pretty much. They did have Mel Lott and Carl Hubble. That was their only two Hall of Famers. And the play ball set, which is one of my favorite sets of all time, had sort of an Art Deco look. It was the only set that was printed in color. It was the only set that really included distinctive biographies in the back. And, you know, the Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio cards are considered iconic. But one of the neatest things about the play ball set is that it was the only set that ever included all three DiMaggio brothers in one set. So that was kind of cool. I'm going to speak briefly about the companies themselves. Oh, did I get out of order? I did. I think I can do it. The double play cards, the cards with two players on it, those were made by Wellington Kramer, his company Gum Products. And this gets really confusing because Gum Products made one set and Gum Incorporated made another. How could you possibly get mixed up with that? But he started his company in 1940. He borrowed $16,000 to start it up. Really, one of the weird things is at this time, it was a perfectly viable career choice to say, I'm going to be a gum salesman. The 30s had so popularized gum, it was no more bizarre than saying, I'm going to be a car salesman, I'm going to sell cell phones. It was something that people did. The neat thing about Kramer's company is that this was their only real offering of baseball cards. It was a good quality set, but they continued to do sets. They had to pause during the war, but they continued to do sets. They did monster cards. They did cards about American history. They did cards that had airplanes. They did all sorts of cards all through, but this was the deepest one in baseball content. Kramer was called to testify in the 1960s, I think 64, against Topps, because Topps had a monopoly. They had exclusive contracts with the players, and he said, I'd love to make baseball cards. That's all the kids want from April until the World Series. But I can't because I don't have players, because Topps had exclusive contracts with all the players. 1941 was the last year that there would be real competition until 1981. This last year there would be 3 sets. But Gum Products really enjoyed a successful run. In 1971, it sold to the Moxie Company, and it continued to operate till 1980. So it had a 40-year run as a company. To me, one of the most interesting people in the baseball card pantheon, if there is such a thing, was Jacob Warren Bowman. He preferred to be called Warren. He was married, divorced, and bankrupt before age 21. He was a man who just refused to take failure as an option. He tried to sell cars in Los Angeles. Cars had not caught on sufficiently for him to be successful there. He tried to run barges in Mexico. That didn't work out. He tried coffee roasting. That wasn't successful either. And he was on his way to Detroit to become an auto worker when he ran into a gum salesman. And he said, I think I'll give this a whirl. And he was a natural at it. He had a really good flair for understanding what people wanted. And he made a gum called Blony, which I don't know if anyone's ever chewed it, but you might remember chunks of gum that were about this big. It was about this big. And his slogan was, you get 3 big bites for a penny. So in the Depression, that resonated with people. And he started putting cards with them. And he did everything. He did Wild West. He did G-Men. He did Mickey Mouse. He did the Horrors of War set. But he was actually really successful. He became a really successful gum salesman, and did complete baseball card sets from 39 to 41. His company got put on hold during World War II because it wasn't an essential industry, as much as I might disagree with that at times. He came back in 1944 and he rebranded it as the Bowman Company. Bowman was the leading producer of baseball cards from the late 40s through the mid-50s. And, you know, cards like Jackie Robinson's first card, Mickey Mantle's first card, Willie Mays' first card, those were all Bowman cards. He eventually sold to Topps, and there's some really interesting stuff if you want to get deep in the woods on that. But after mothballing the Bowman brand for years, Topps began releasing cards under the name Bowman again. And they still release some cards under Bowman's name, which I think is a great legacy for him. And then the third set was the Gowdy set. Enos Gowdy was just one of the legends of baseball cards. He made the 1933 set, which is in the middle, and it had great biographies on the back. It had 4 Babe Ruth cards, and it is, if you're a baseball card collector, it is the card. It's one of the 3 foundational card sets in the hobby, along with the T206 and the 52 Topps set. By the time we got to 1941, though, his company had pretty well run out of steam. As I said, the player selection wasn't very good, and it would be, even though he produced a lot of other sets, he did things with Boy Scouts, which I think Stephen might be interested in, and lawmen and Indians. The company had pretty well run its course in the 41 issue, and so it was no longer really. You could just tell by the product. It was time for it to call it a day. But it was the last year, and it is a very difficult set to collect because it just didn't have the distribution that the others did. Between the 3 sets, they represented the vast majority of the regular players that appeared in the majors in 1941. They had really some very significant rookie cards: Pee Wee Reese, Lou Boudreau, Phil Rizzuto, Johnny Mize, English Slaughter, and some others. And I think it's really neat that all 3 were issued with bubblegum. Bubblegum itself has a fascinating history, which I touch on in the book, but I could talk for a long time, and you don't have a long time. But it's very neat that bubblegum was never patented. The reason bubblegum is pink is because that what happened to be the only food coloring that was in the building at the time. And because it wasn't patented, a lot of different companies were able to produce bubblegum, which in the 30s was a really big thing. The war, which started in 42, impacted a lot of players. More than 500 current or future major league players would serve in some capacity in World War II. Some of them saw really bad action, really deep in the scrum. Others basically played for the baseball team on their on their base. Two former major leaguers, Harry O'Neill, who was a catcher for the A's, and Elmer Gideon, who was an outfielder for the Senators, died. All reports indicate that probably as many as 70 professional baseball players in Japan were killed in the war effort. The war impacted careers in different ways. Some of the old players had a few extra years of glory because the younger guys got called off to war. Some of the younger players, their skills atrophied, or they got injuries, and they never were able to come back. So it affected players, but it affected some negatively and some others not so much so. And I think one of the really interesting things that I found as I was studying this book is that players' off seasons and post-major league careers were so different than modern players. Generally speaking, after a player's major league career would wrap up, he would go back and play in the minor leagues for a few years. There were no baseball teams west of St. Louis. So you could go and play in El Paso, you could go and play in San Francisco, San Diego, and have a really good lifestyle. Get to be a baseball hero for a few more years. The pay was pitiful, really pitiful. So much so Stan Musial threatened to quit baseball this year because he and his wife were just struggling to buy food. And so as a result, baseball players had to find other jobs in the off season. And very often you'd have the players would stay in baseball after their career with the parent clubs. There are a couple of reasons. One is there aren't a whole lot of college-educated baseball players. And the other is when you've had success in one thing in your whole life, it is hard to put that one thing down. I have just a couple of player stories before we wrap this up that I found particularly interesting. Babe Dahlgren is best known as the answer to the bar trivia question, who replaced Lou Gehrig after his 2,130th consecutive game streak? That was Babe Dahlgren. Dahlgren played semi-pro and worked as a bookkeeper in a plumbing supply company in San Francisco in the early 30s. He was discovered by Pacific League scout who was putting together a team for the Tucson Missions in the Class D Arizona-Texas League. He did well and was promoted to the San Francisco Seals before the Boston Red Sox bought his contract in 1934. He played regularly in 1935, batting .263 and belting 9 homers in 149 games and shining in the field. Despite this promising beginning, he was displaced by Jimmy Fox and spent the next 2 seasons in the minors before being purchased by the Yankees. From 1938 to 1946, he would stick in the bigs. His highlights were being part of the 1939 World Championship Yankees and making the 1943 All-Star team as a member of the Phillies. Dahlgren's career, I found this fascinating. Dahlgren's career was hampered by rumors that he used marijuana. It seems to have no basis in fact, but he voluntarily became the first baseball player to be drug tested. His grandson's book, Rumor in Town, tells how Dahlgren's career was tarnished by the claims of drug use. One of the things that the Gowdy set really did right, I thought was absolutely fascinating, is if you look closely, or you can look at one of the illustrations in the book, his card says Phillies pitcher, first major leaguer to be drafted in the U.S. Army. Right-hander Mulcahy was a workhorse on some pretty weak Phillies teams in the 30s and 40s. His lopsided loss-to-win record earned him the nickname Losing Pitcher. He was often among the league's leaders in dubious distinctions, including losses, games pitched, hits allowed, runs allowed, bases on balls, hit batters, and wild pitches. Still, he was effective enough to stay in the rotation and often accounted for more than his fair share of a team's win. His 12-9 record midway through the 1941 season earned him a spot on the NL All-Star squad. But later that year, he had a 12-game losing streak and ended with 13 wins, but his team only won 49. He missed 41 through 45 in military service and earned a Bronze Star fighting in the Pacific Theater. He returned in August 1945 and received a huge ovation when he took the field. He hung on a couple more years, finishing up with the Pirates, posting a 45-80 record. After his career, he spent 2 decades with the White Sox organization as a coach and administrator. And the last player story, and again, there are over 100 in the book, but the last player story I wanted to share with you, I always found interesting. When I used to own a baseball card shop, I had a young woman come in and say, "Do you have an Eldon Ocker card? He's my uncle." And Eldon Ocker would occasionally come to Roanoke in order to visit his niece. He had a weird pitching motion. He was a very good football player. He injured his arm playing football, and he threw underhand. So they call it submarine style. A grade 3 sports star at Kansas State, Sports Illustrated named Ocker number 33 on their list of the 50 greatest athletes from Kansas. Football great Bronco Nagurski offered Ocker a $6,000 contract to play football for the Chicago Bears, but he decided to sign with the Detroit Tigers instead. The submarine-style pitcher had an effective 10-year career starting in 1933. He was a member of the 1935 World Champion squad, going 18-7, and genuinely enjoyed living in the Motor City. After the 1938 season, he was traded to the White Sox, where he clashed with Joe Cronin. He developed a lifelong friendship with Ted Williams. After the 1939 season ended, he informed the Red Sox ownership he would retire if he wasn't traded. So he was traded to the St. Louis Browns, where he became an effective pitcher for a poor team. A product of the Depression, Ocker was always looking for ways to earn extra money in the off-season. In 1938, he began working for the Midwest Abrasive Company, learning the business from the ground up. The company developed a process to remove microscopic rough spots from the interior of 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft barrels, a critical step in fabricating accurate guns. By the end of 1942, Ocker left baseball in favor of the war effort. He was successful in the industry and advanced to the position of president and held many leadership roles in the industry group. Okay, whose birthday is in September? Is anybody's birthday in September? No birthdays in September. Oh, no. Okay, how about October? Okay, I got 1, 2, 3. Who is the closest to October 10th?
18.
18 is pretty close.
I'm 17.
16.
16. All right. You win an Eldon Ocker card. Yeah, and this is a genuine 1941 Eldon Ocker card. These cards, although they can get pricey, a nice Joe DiMaggio or Ted Williams can be pretty pricey. A card like an Ocker is maybe a $10 or $15 card, which as a hobby is a very attainable, enjoyable price point. I'm going to quickly wrap up by saying, I don't think this is what my life, I hope this isn't all my life is remembered to be, but sometimes the universe just says howdy, and it says, this is something that you got to think about doing. And this happened, there are 3 things that happened in the pursuit of this book. The first one happened many years ago. I was involved in the fundraising for the National D-Day Foundation in Bedford. As a very young person, I had the opportunity to work with Steven Spielberg's people and Charles Schulz's people, and it was incredible. But the most incredible thing was that I got to meet some of the Bedford boys. And I think there were 8 surviving then, and just their stories. And I would do a monthly newsletter, and one of them I got to interview a woman who had typed the D-Day invasion plans for Eisenhower. And they would take her into a little, they said, she and Ike would go into a little cement room, a little cinder block room. They would post 2 guards outside, totally indescript, and she would work all day typing every word that he had. She said she was from Woonsocket, Rhode Island, I think, and she said, all the guys were gone, I had to do something, and I knew I could type. And she was actually the one who was picked to work with the great man in doing the D-Day invasion plans. Just a wonderful woman. But I said, did it occur to you the importance of the thing that you were doing? And she said, oh heavens no, I was just trying not to make typos. and then at the end of the day, they would take, they didn't have copying machines in, so she did one copy with 2 carbons. They would take the carbons, and the guards would burn the carbons, and they would be distributed. Just a wonderful, wonderful experience that got me really interested. A second thing that happened was I've collected cards for a long time, and a friend of mine that I've known for a while hit on some money problems, and he said, Todd, I've got a big box of stuff. Do you want it? He said, I'll sell it to you for $50. I said, I'll pay you $75. He was a nice guy, he just needs money. But among that box was this program. I'm going to pass it around. Don't stomp on it, it's a little fragile. But this is from Game 15 of Joe DiMaggio's, it's a scorecard from Game 15 of Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak when they played the Red Sox. So it's got scorekeeping from both the Red Sox, and also it's got scorekeeping from Williams. Had a pretty good game that day. The ads, everything about it is just fascinating. And if it doesn't get all the way around, I'll have it with me afterwards. The final thing, which I'm sorry, I'm going to have to read this because it's just too long for me not to. I'll start this around the other section. Do any of you know John Montgomery? Mm-hmm. Yeah. John and I have been friends a long time. He helped me with this book, and he helped me with my previous book. But this was a scorebook John came across. Just as my book was coming out, my friend John Montgomery was on his annual trip to the world's largest yard sale. A 690-mile continuous trail of treasure stretching along Route 127 from Michigan to Alabama. While stopping in Paulding, Ohio, John visited the Sports Guy, a vendor he seeks out every year. Among the items for sale was this old Wilson scorebook. Inside were dozens of games that were scored in a youthful hand from 1941. Curious, John began to research the scorebook's origins. If you look in the inside, you'll see the name Richard Hughes is written on there. Paulding, Ohio is just a few miles north of Van Wert, and in addition to keeping score for a lot of big league games from virtually every major league team, he also had score records from the local rec league teams in Van Wert. As I flipped through the records of the games featuring DiMaggio, Williams, Reese, and all the other players I'd connected to during my writing project, I could almost see a young Hughes sitting by the family Philco, hanging on the radio announcer's every word. Many of the games were scored in their totality. Some were abandoned along about the 5th inning. Maybe the radio signal got lost. Maybe young Richard got sent off to bed. The local kids might have recruited him for a game of their own. These records were an open-ended question, and sure, it would be easy enough for me to research them, but the records are just perfect the way they are. John eventually figured out that the scorebook likely belonged to Richard's son, and Richard was 14 during the 1941 season. He would go on to serve in the U.S. Air Corps at the end of World War II, and work for the post office delivering the local newspaper. He was a sports fan. According to his obituary, he refereed games and he worked as a newspaper stringer. And with the exception of his service, it seems that Richard never lived his entire life within 20 miles of Van Wert. John thinks the scorebook had passed to Richard's son Kevin, who died last year, and it was likely part of his estate. John purchased it from the Sports Guy, and he gave it to me as a gift. Scorekeeping is a dying art, and one I personally enjoy. Truth be told, it was probably my most valuable contribution to my high school baseball team back in the day. To have this relic from the 1941 season is something I'll treasure forever. It's more than just a piece of history. My friend John gave it to me, but the universe wanted me to have it. That is my show, and you have been so patient and kind. I can't thank you enough. Do we have any questions, comments, thoughts?
Go ahead, you first.
Did you know Larry LeGrand here?
I did. Wasn't he an amazing guy?
Isn't he fun?
Oh, he was. Yes, yes. He was. He was a Negro League catcher who had really caught after major leagues had been integrated in Negro Leagues. But he was a traveling catcher who caught Satchel Paige in the Satchel Paige All-Stars. Satchel Paige was a brilliant businessman. And he figured out that he would be just as well off to pitch one inning and have people pay and pitch game after game after game than he would to pitch 9 innings on one game and then have to rest for 3 days. So Larry LeGrand was his catcher, and he lived in Salem for a while.
So my question has to do with the players that are represented on the cards. In modern society, in the modern world, Major League Baseball has the rights to all the players, and then they sell those to Topps or to Bowman. But back then, it was all individual contracts, there's individual rights for the players that each one of these baseball companies would have had to purchase in order to put the cards.
As often as not, they just did it. And one of the interesting things, in the 1941 double play set, Johnny Mize actually sued Gum Products, saying, you don't have the right to use my name and image. And it was, while nothing really came of that lawsuit, it was one of the first lawsuits to assert that a name, image, and likeness had a value. And it really started that ball rolling. But the Gum Incorporated just argued, hey, we bought the picture from a news agency, so therefore we have the right to use it. They hadn't thought that there was a real value in that way. Although every now and then you get somebody like that was of the stature of a Babe Ruth who would sign an exclusive contract.
And if that's the case, they just did it. Why didn't everyone print Joe DiMaggio cards in 41? Why didn't everyone print Ted Williams cards in 41?
Well, 2 of the 3 sets did. As I said, the Gowdy set was just odd. It defies logic. It's just like they just said, hey, we've got this stack of pictures. Let's make cards of these guys. Some of the guys played only a few games. Some of the guys had retired in 1938. It's a weird little set. It really is.
I've heard that some of the players had very distinguished war records, particularly Ted Williams. What can you tell us about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, Williams would have probably been over 600 home runs if he hadn't lost, you know, basically 5 good years to the war. But any number of players, you know, had distinguished service. Some of them, I forget which one it was. There's a pitcher that's mentioned in the book that he lost the end of his finger, and that wouldn't be a big deal to most people, but the end of the finger, if you're a pitcher, is a pretty big deal. You know, Warren Spahn, who became a great pitcher for the Braves, he was not a very effective player prior to this. He had just a cup of coffee in 41, but he saw really serious action, and he came back nervous and twitchy, and no one will ever know if that's what reset him, but he went from being a not very successful pitcher to being a very successful pitcher. But, you know, Williams was incredible. Any number of the people who actually served, I have so much respect for, because they could have very easily done what a lot of them did. And who's to blame somebody if your job is to go out and play baseball on the you know, on the post, or go get shot at by Germans? Playing baseball on the post sounds pretty good.
Several things, Todd. Speaking of the universe and saying howdy, of all the people who had October birthdays, only one of us was an actual baseball card collector, and that's who got the card. So,
oh, very good.
Kelly got that card. That was so cool. She does not have that card previously, so that's really good.
Very good.
The second thing is, while I just got the curious bug to look up on eBay while you were talking about showing off some of these cards in the play ball set. Joe, one of the top prices for a Joe DiMaggio 1941 play ball set was $59. These are sold actualized prices, $59.99.95. Most of them are coming in at $1,800 for the more pedestrian versions of these play ball sets. And then, as you said, a lot of them, of the lesser names, are coming in at $15 a pop. So. But wow, go back and check your shoe boxes.
Well, and people will say to me, oh, it's only worth $10. They were 2 for a penny. You know, you gotta think, that's a pretty good rate of return.
The last thing I wanted to say was how you went from, I don't know if anybody noticed this, but you went from talking about building websites to 1941 baseball. And not only culturally, but just technologically, that is such a jarring shift in a less than 5-second gap. For you really have to consider, I do a lot, how drastically different a website of baseball today. You asked how many of us are baseball fans today and watch the recent World Series versus then, and the whole pace, the meter, the tempo, life, everything just is so vastly different in 1941 in the tone of baseball versus today. And even us growing up listening to radio, the AM radio, and for me in Roanoke, it was the Baltimore Orioles in the mid-60s, and it's just everything was slower then. So that's what resonated with me about your talk. And so I don't know if you address any of that in the book or if you have any thoughts on that, but it just seemed like we were just sort of waiting to go to war. And I've done a lot of record research from that period for the Boy Scouts articles. And it really is amazing to me how we weren't on high alert, but we were waiting. And there was so anyways, I just lay that background out there for you in the context of your book in 1941, which is a very excellent way you presented that. I don't know if any comments on that.
How did the Japanese become interested in baseball before the war?
They had been, I don't recollect right off what the impetus was, but they had college teams, high school teams that would play even back in the 20s and before. If you read about Mo Berg, there was a major league team that went over to have exhibition games, and they said that Mo Berg, who was a catcher for the A's, took a camera and took pictures but this was before the war, but took pictures to try to map out what Japan was like. You know, I think there's a book called The Catcher is a Spy about Mo Berg's thing. But after the war, you know, the baseball culture was one of the things that helped rebuild Japan, just giving them a diversion. Lefty O'Gould, who was a great American baseball player, went over there and was a huge ambassador. Actually, the whole I collect a little bit of Japanese baseball cards here and there because I think they're fascinating. You know, if you go back and read some of the Japanese baseball history, it's incredible. Some of the players and the stories. They had a pitcher named Victor Starfin who was Russian, and literally they pressured him by threatening his family that he had to pitch in their for the teams that they said that he would. It's baseball is you can take any part of baseball that you want and find something interesting. Because it's not a game, it's a people game. And there's a lot of people, there's a lot of individualism in it, which I think is endlessly fascinating.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Are those major league players in that picture?
Yes, this is
Looks like
Joe DiMaggio, Vince DiMaggio, and Joe DiMaggio, Don DiMaggio, and Vince DiMaggio playing catch out back of their family's restaurant. If anyone there is no pressure, but if anyone wants a book, they're $20 each. I have them. I'm happy to sign them. We take cash, checks. We can take credit cards, Venmo, or CI gift certificates.
I am so grateful for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.